Time for another Model A update, eh? I wanted to, start making individual project videos again. However, those were just some small projects, miscellaneous bits and bobs here and there. So I decided to open a new category called the Model A Mechanics Log, and this is part number 4 because I included the other miscellaneous Model A related machining videos into that series. And well, today we're going to tackle a couple of projects which let's not further dwell on, but much rather jump into it right away. Topic number 1, dating the car. Now, I don't mean that in a literal sense with nice lighting and a proper dinner and something like that. No. While the car was in pieces and many parts were easily look-atable, I found out that the car was pieced together quite a bit. The left fender is different to the right, there are different fender brackets left to right, and I got quite interested in finding out what most of the car at least was built and when it was built. And very kind viewer John, the same guy who gave me the V8 emblem, also sent me these Model A judging standards. The judging standards is a huge book full of information about every which part of the car you can imagine, and it goes down to, every nut and bolt, what was used in what year, from when until when, and it allows you to date just about every component that's mounted in the car. So I decided to do that, and I know you guys are thinking, well, just look at the serial number of the engine, look at the serial number of the frame, that's it. Well, number 1, the frame serial number is concealed, you can't look at that. The serial number of my engine isn't correct, it was built in 1934, so, it's mostly a cobbled together work art of pieces, and I just wanted to know what most of the parts were made in, and that I did. While going through this, I'm going to skip the obvious pieces. My car was not built in the time between 1927 and 1929, so we can skip all that. That being said, one of the items I was able to date the most accurately was, surprisingly enough, the frame, because even without having the serial number of it, I could pinpoint it on a couple of holes which were there or not there. For example, there was a hole in the front cross member to guide the radiator overflow tube. That made me notice that my radiator had the overflow tube on the wrong side. Anyways, the holes that weren't there were the holes for the side mount spare. And they were center punched up until November 1930. And regardless whether you ticked the option or not, these holes were drilled through to mount a side spare from December 1930 onwards. I have the center punch marks, but I don't have the holes yet, so I can make pretty darn sure that my frame was leaving the factory between November 1930 and December 1930. The shock absorbers, they're an item which can be switched out, and so I'm not surprised that they don't match up with that. They were built between March and August 1930, which you can see by the hex-headed adjustment screw and the Hudaye and patent number imprints on the housing. The steering box, you saw that in my steering box revival video, is the type used from January 1930 onwards. The pedals were used after November 1930 because they are single-piece stamped and not cast. The handbrake is a type used later than April 1930. Again, you can see that by the support bracket in the middle on the frame. The tie rod points towards November 1930 also because the grease fittings are facing the rear of the car, not the front. The front spring shackles are the type used after February 1930 because they are single-piece round and not flat at the top part. The cross struts at the rear were used from April 1930 onwards because they also are stamped sheet welded together and not single-piece cast or anything drop forged like that. The engine, said before, it's from January 1935, judging by the head. And taking a look at the diamond on the block, it for sure is a diamond block replacement engine. The flywheel housing, funnily enough, is a type used between February and July 1929, which you can see by cast-in bosses where the cover plate for the rear main bearing sits. They are not used, only 3 are drilled and tapped, but this type was only used between February and July 29. And, well, that shows you that the engine has been out and it has been pieced together sometime in the past before. The cross strut on the rear bumpers was used from March 1930 to May 31, which doesn't have a raised boss yet, but it is already a piece of stamped sheet metal. Maybe you can recall the pulley of my generator, which exploded a while back. That's the type used from April 1930 onwards, with the 3 ribs and the short taper. The carburetor, I think, is a type used from January 1930 onwards, judging by the script, which has already Zenith 1 cast into it, not just Zenith. The running boards themselves have a style used from October 1930 onwards, and the cabin has a serial number stamped into it, which Paul Shin told me was pointing towards 1931 and being made in San Francisco. That is further reinforced by a piece of sheet metal stamped into the cabin where the front screw mounts it down. The types before October 1930 were clamped down using simply a washer, and the splash apron is the single piece style, which was used from October 1930 onwards. Concluding all that together makes me damn sure that my car, or the majority of the car, was made between November and December 1930, with the exception of the cabin, which was put on from a car from 1931. One more interesting thing I stumbled across while scouring through the book, I found that the seat bench was actually adjustable at some point. You can see a small knob down there, and that is also listed in the parts catalog for my model and make of car. I don't have that, but it is clearly visible that it was once there because the holes are there. Probably one of my future projects would be to rebuild it. It's not necessary whatsoever, but still, I'm going to put everything in it that was available at the time. Topic number 2 is my spare wheel holder. We've just now spent quite some time dating everything and finding out when it was built, and one thing springs into my mind. Take a look at this picture of a 1928-29-ish car, and then compare that to a 1930-31 model. You may be able to see that the spare wheel holder is slanted towards the car, which not only makes it look a little more modern, but it also makes it much easier to reach over the spare to load goods into your trunk. I had a look at that and compared that to my car, and the spare wheel holder on mine is absolutely straight, so it is probably made for a 28-29 model. Can't find one over here for 30-31, you're lucky if you get one at all. So I decided to cut it in half, right at the seam where the flange for the spare wheel is at, and then turn the flange 180 degrees around, saw a small triangle out of it, and that in combine, welded back together, makes the wheel come closer towards the car and tilt at a slight angle, which then looks a lot nicer. You have to of course pay attention that you can still open the trunk and get the handle past the wheel. Otherwise it's kind of futile to do the whole adaptation to make loading stuff in easier when you can't load in stuff at all now. The last thing that I made regarding the spare wheel is take a look at this brochure here. The spare tire cover on this one isn't just around the perimeter where the tire is, but it's enclosing the entire spare wheel. I tried to find something similar online, didn't find anything, so I have to conclude that the illustrator of this picture simply did that to save himself from drawing all the individual spokes, and so that the Ford lettering can be made a bit more visible here. However, I really liked the appeal of that and decided to try that myself. Took me 3 attempts actually. During the first 2 I simply draw out and cut out and sawed in a circular piece into the already existing shell, which, you know, gave me a good idea of what it was supposed to look like when fully closed. However, I didn't like the look of, you know, the seam in the middle and then just stitching something into that. Looked a little makeshift. So I then went the extra mile and cut out the original sawn-in circular piece and fully replaced it with a new one and wedged all those 3 pieces back together and then in the sewing machine, you know, made it look as if it was original. It still looked a little bit plain to me, so then I ordered a larger Ford script and put that onto there. Already a little better. Now I'm contemplating whether to put some other stickers, maybe a pin-up doll or something like that onto the other side. But overall I think I like the closed look a lot more than, you know, the open with the spokes. It just looks a little bit more refined. That's just my attempt at making the car a little bit more personal with small modifications to make it stand out from the crowd without just flat out chopping, channeling the whole deal and throwing a V8 in it. Talking about chopping and channeling, I shortened the exhaust tube a little bit. My exhaust is somewhat custom cobbled together pieces of tubing, and that made it a little bit too long, stick beyond the rear axle so that you can't take the rear axle out without removing the exhaust. Now I cut that a little bit shorter, so that is possible in the future, and I slanted it at an angle because that's just the shit I do. I have since checked the valve lash one more time, without really anything to report. While I had the cover off, however, I decided to put one small modification into it, which is a sight glass. Drill it, tap it, screw the sight glass in, and now I know whether the oil pump is actually pumping oil into it, just in case I should be worried about it. Some people told me that, especially with the partial flow oil filter, it might be critical upon idle that the oil pump doesn't pump enough oil for the main bearings. You know, just take a look at the sight glass. Even at the slowest of idle, the sight glass just fills up regularly, and I don't think any harm can be done, other than making the idle too low, where the oil can't distribute evenly around the crankshaft and form a proper cushion right around it. But that's just the principle of the car. There is no pressure oil feed, so there is no oil pressure other than that generated from rotating about in itself. Next topic is a delicate one. It's the carburetor. Here is my issue. The car runs fine with the gas adjustment valve, let's say a quarter to halfway open. However, with that being said, it then consumes about 14.5 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. That's around about 16 miles to the gallon, which is a little bit too much in my opinion. The picture of the spark plugs, it's okay. It doesn't look like it's running too rich. However, while I'm driving along, I can close the gas valve all the way without any problems. The problems then start when I get to a traffic light or coast downhill, because as soon as I enter engine braking, it then starts missing and hitting and shooting out of the carburetor.
Jesus! Yes!
As well as when I hit a stoplight and I brake down for it, then the entire engine starts getting rumbly and misbehaving. Once again, I can fix that issue by just simply opening the gas adjustment valve a little bit more. However, I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. I think it should be possible to lean it out to where it performs optimally at all speeds, and you don't have to open it up when you want to slow down. Here's the things I've checked. Maybe you have a clue as well. I've checked the float level, that's okay, 5/8 below the ceiling surface. I've checked the jet heights, there is data on that. I've checked that all the passages are clear, checked the secondary well that it's clear. I've changed out the gas adjustment valve needle and seat because they were a little bit scored. I sealed the throttle shaft up to eliminate any leakage air there, bored it, reamed it out, and then put small O-rings into places. I checked the manifold where both surfaces of the manifold and the carburetor are screwed against each other and filed those flat so it can't leak there. I've checked the manifold itself for leaks using brake clean while idling the engine. If there is a leak, in my opinion, it should start running faster when you spray brake clean into said leak. I found a hairline crack in the cap jet and I thought soldering shut would cure the issue.
But it didn't!
And last not least, I found a little something here which I thought would make sense. That right down in there is the hole which supplies the air for the idle circuit, so that when the butterfly is shut, the air is sucked through that hole and powers the secondary well. Now when I close the butterfly, that almost covers up the idle hole in its entirety. So I'm thinking, the idle plate should be lower like this in order for this to work properly. And for that we can either file that down a little. Well, turns out after all that the engine idles great, but as soon as I hit the throttle, then the engine just dies. So I threw my filed butterfly plate out and replaced it with a regular one. And I'm back to square one. The last thing I can check now is whether the flow rate through the jets is the one that it's supposed to be. But I think it can't be that far off. Still, I'm planning on doing that. My opinion would be that since the trouble is only during idle and in the area between idle and full speed, it's got something to do with the secondary well, because that supplies the idle mixture as well as the cap jet. And once I'm reaching full speed, or speeds above say 50 kilometers an hour, I don't need the cap jet anymore. What makes me wonder is that I can drastically affect idle speed and idle performance by turning the gas adjustment valve. In my opinion, the only idle mixture supplied would be through that little hole that I showed you there in the throat of the carburetor, with no effects whatsoever on the cap jet because the butterfly is closed and it doesn't have anything to do with all the needles below it. That's just my train of thoughts here. Maybe you know a lot more than I do. Paul Shin, for example, thinks it is a vacuum leak. I'm still waiting for new gaskets to arrive, so I might just alleviate the problem by that. However, I, for my part, am pretty sure that it isn't a leak because, as I said, I checked it with brake clean. And here is a question for all the aficionados. Why isn't the vacuum wiper called a gigantic vacuum leak? Because I would imagine if a little leak somewhere at a gasket could cause misfires and bad running altogether, why doesn't this thing affect the idle at all when I switch it on? Any help, greatly appreciated. Does your car do this missing and popping and false idling when you turn the gas adjustment valve all the way down and sit at a traffic light or go downhill? Comments below. Right, 2 more topics and we're done. Topic number 1 is rather quickly. Since we've just talked about the vacuum wiper, you all know and love the problem that when going uphill the wiper just stalls because when the butterfly is open all the way there is no reason for the engine to suck vacuum from that tiny line going to the vacuum wiper. While when you're going downhill and the butterfly is closed, all the air gets sucked from the wiper and it just goes bananas. I've tried to remedy that issue by putting a storage compartment in between, a tank, which I fashioned out of an old brake cleaner bottle with 2 holes and pipes soldered into it, and I just tucked that into the line going to the vacuum wiper. It did actually make a difference. It's not a fully constant wiper by any means now, but going up the hills you actually notice that it never really comes to a stop. It always still keeps on moving at a slight slow speed, which is a great improvement in my opinion. However, sadly, the tin can didn't turn out to be rigid enough. After some time I heard some hissing and crackling noise from down there and found out, well, it had crushed completely. So I'm working on a more rigid solution right now. In the meantime, you've probably noticed that weird reflective stuff in the rear. That is vibration dampening mat, because I still, regardless of all the balancing and all the counterweight crankshaft and whatever I've done to smooth out the engine, I'm still not completely happy with the noise level in the car.
Stop rattling at me!
I mean, I've done all I could and it has become a lot better than before having overhauled the engine, but there is still some inherent humming, especially when going at greater speeds, say above 70 kilometers an hour. Up until then I would say it's okay, but above that it's just the same old boombox that it has always been. So with those dampening mats, which I installed everywhere on large sheets of metal, like the doors and the splash aprons and the covers and the deck lid on the trunk. So in my opinion, this took a bit of the harshness out of the vibration, especially when you knock onto the sheet metal, then you can't hear it echoing that much anymore. Closing the doors sounds super solid now. And it's just made it a little bit more comfortable to cruise around at higher speeds for long amounts of time. That shall conclude this video for now. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your comments down in the section below, you know the drill. And tune in next time. See you guys, bye bye.